Welcome to this journey through one of the most profound transformations ever documented in the Ozark Plateau. In the years when men worked trap lines through winter months, when solitude in frozen forests was a necessary condition of livelihood, when spending weeks alone in cold and silence was simply the price of survival, there walked a man who entered the winter woods as one person and emerged as someone his own family struggled to recognize. Leave a comment where you're watching from as we trace the boundary between hardship and transformation, between endurance and fundamental change. This video is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Before we follow Jacob Harlan into those winter woods, consider what extended isolation meant on the frontier, and why it was understood to be dangerous not just to the body, but to something less tangible and more essential. Men who worked trap lines alone through winter were known to change, to become quiet, to lose the capacity for easy conversation, to develop habits and thought patterns that seemed strange to those who had remained in human company. These changes were expected, were temporary, were the normal cost of months spent in solitude. A man might come back from a winter trap line somewhat altered, but he would return to himself within weeks of being back among family and community. What made Jacob Harlan's experience different was not that he changed, but that he changed in ways that did not reverse with time or warmth, or the return to human contact, that the winter had taken something from him, or had given him something that could not be removed, and that the man who emerged from the woods in March of 1893 remained fundamentally different from the man who had entered them in November of 1892, altered not temporarily, but permanently by whatever he had experienced during those 4 months alone in the frozen wilderness. Jacob Harlan was 32 years old in the fall of 1892, married to Ruth for 8 years, father to 3 children aged 7, 5, and 2. He had worked trap lines for 12 years, had spent winters in isolation before, and was experienced in the particular demands of surviving alone in winter forest. He was known as a capable man, steady in temperament, reliable in judgment, the kind of person who could be trusted to endure hardship without complaint and to return safely from situations that might break less resilient individuals. The trap line he established in November of 1892 ran through approximately 30 miles of forest in the Ozark Plateau, following creeks and ridges in territory that was remote even by the standards of a region that was largely wilderness. He built a small cabin at the approximate center of his line, stocked it with supplies sufficient for 4 months, and established a routine that would allow him to check his traps every few days, while spending the majority of his time in the cabin, maintaining equipment and processing the furs he collected. This was standard practice for winter trapping. The isolation was expected, the solitude was manageable for men with the right temperament, and the financial return from a successful season made the hardship worthwhile. Jacob had done this before, had returned from previous winters somewhat worn and quiet, but fundamentally himself, had readjusted to family life within a few weeks, and had given Ruth no reason to worry that this winter would be any different from those he had already survived. He departed for the trap line on November 12th, 1892. Ruth and the children saw him off from their homestead near what would eventually become the town of Willow Springs, Missouri. The goodbye was routine, without premonition, marked by the practical concerns of ensuring he had adequate supplies, and by the understanding that they would see him again in March, when the trapping season ended and when travel became possible with the spring thaw. Jacob was in good health, in good spirits, equipped with everything he needed for a successful winter. There was no indication that this departure would be different from the others that had preceded it. The winter of 1892 to 1893 was severe by Ozark standards. Heavy snow fell in late November and continued intermittently through January, creating accumulations that made travel difficult and that isolated Jacob even more thoroughly than usual from the possibility of contact with other trappers or with settlements. Temperatures dropped well below zero for extended periods. Cold that made working outside dangerous and that required constant attention to maintaining warmth in the small cabin that was his only shelter. But severe winters were not unprecedented, and Jacob had the experience and the supplies to endure them. The isolation he faced was more complete than in previous years, but isolation was the expected condition of winter trapping. The cold was harsher than usual, but he had firewood and clothing adequate to survive it. Nothing about the conditions he faced was beyond what an experienced trapper could manage. The winter was difficult, but it was not impossible. What happened to Jacob during those 4 months cannot be fully documented because he was alone and because the records that exist come primarily from what he said after his return, statements that were fragmentary, inconsistent, and that suggested experiences which were difficult to reconcile with what should have been possible during a winter spent working a trapline. But the physical evidence of his condition when he emerged, combined with the testimony of those who encountered him, creates a picture of someone who had endured something beyond ordinary hardship, something that had changed him in ways that extended far deeper than the expected effects of the isolation and cold. Jacob was expected to return to his homestead in mid-March, when warming weather and melting snow would make the 30-mile journey from his trapline to his home manageable. Ruth began watching for him in early March, knowing that the exact timing would depend on conditions, but that he would come as soon as travel was possible. March 10th passed with no sign of him. March 15th. March 20th. By late March, Ruth was concerned enough to speak with neighbors, to ask whether anyone had seen Jacob or had news from trappers who might have encountered him. On March 28th, 16 days later than expected, Jacob appeared at the homestead. Ruth saw him approaching from a distance and went out to meet him, her relief at his return mixing with immediate concern about what she saw. Jacob was thin, far thinner than he should have been, even accounting for the physical demands of winter trapping. His clothes were in poor condition, torn and inadequately repaired. His face was weathered in ways that suggested exposure beyond what should have been necessary. But more disturbing than his physical condition was his manner. He walked slowly, seemed uncertain of his direction, despite being on the path to his own home. And when Ruth called out to him, he showed no recognition or response until she was directly in front of him. When she spoke his name, he looked at her with an expression that suggested he was having difficulty placing who she was or why she would be calling to him. The recognition came slowly, as if he was remembering something from a long time ago, rather than seeing his wife of 8 years. He spoke her name, Ruth, as if testing whether it was correct, and then seemed to orient himself, to remember where he was and why she would be there. Ruth helped him to the cabin, speaking to him constantly, asking questions about his journey and his condition. Jacob responded minimally, with single words or brief phrases that provided little information. He was exhausted, clearly, but his exhaustion seemed to extend beyond physical fatigue into something deeper, a kind of detachment or distance that made even simple conversation feel like it required enormous effort. Over the following days, as Jacob rested and regained some physical strength, his family began to understand that something fundamental had changed. He recognized them, knew their names, understood his relationship to them, but he seemed to relate to them from a distance, as if they were familiar, but not quite real, as if the family and the homestead and the normal life they represented were something he observed rather than something he was part of. He spoke very little, and when he did speak, his responses were often delayed, as if he had to translate their words from some other language before he could process them. Simple questions. Are you hungry? Do you need more wood for the fire? How do you feel? Required long pauses before he answered, and his answers were sometimes inappropriate or strange, as if he had misunderstood what was being asked or was responding to a different question than the one that had been posed. The children were frightened by him. They knew he was their father, but he did not interact with them in the ways they remembered. He did not pick them up, or play with them, or show the affection that had characterized his relationship with them before the winter. When they approached him, he would look at them with an expression that was not quite recognition, would sometimes speak their names, but would not engage with them beyond that minimal acknowledgement. The 7-year-old told Ruth that father is still in the woods, a child's way of expressing that the man in their cabin was physically present, but somehow not entirely there. Ruth tried to understand what had happened, asked Jacob about his winter, about the conditions he had faced, about whether he had been injured or ill. Jacob's responses were fragmentary and difficult to follow. He spoke about the cold, about the silence, about the snow. He described checking his trapline, maintaining his cabin, the routine work of survival. But he also spoke about things that made less sense, about forgetting, about watching himself from a distance, about time that passed differently than it should have, about silence that was so complete that his own thoughts became loud enough to be painful. When pressed for details, for specific events or experiences that might explain his condition, Jacob would retreat into silence, or would say things that suggested his grip on what had actually happened, versus what he had imagined or dreamed during the isolation was uncertain. He spoke about walking his trapline and finding no tracks, not just no animal tracks, but no tracks from his own previous passages, as if he had never been there before, despite having checked the same traps the day before. He described days when the sun did not move in the sky, when morning lasted for what felt like hours, or days before transitioning to afternoon. He mentioned hearing his own voice speaking when he had not spoken, calling to him from the woods, using his name. These accounts could have been the products of isolation-induced hallucination, the kind of perceptual distortions that extreme solitude and sensory deprivation are known to create. Men who spent months alone in wilderness sometimes experienced such things, heard voices that were not there, saw movement that was tricks of light and exhaustion, lost track of time and routine in ways that created false memories or confused perceptions. These experiences were known, were expected to some degree, and normally resolved once the person returned to normal human contact and regular sleep and adequate food. But Jacob's distortions seemed to persist rather than resolve. Weeks after his return, after rest and food and the warmth of home, he still spoke about his winter in ways that suggested the boundary between what had actually happened and what he had imagined remained unclear to him. He still responded to his family with that strange distance, still seemed to be partly absent, even when he was sitting in the same room with them. Ruth consulted with a doctor from a settlement 20 miles distant, bringing him to the homestead to examine Jacob. The doctor found no physical explanation for Jacob's condition beyond the expected effects of a hard winter. He was undernourished but recovering, showed signs of frostbite on his fingers and toes but nothing permanent, had lost weight but was regaining it with adequate food. The doctor spoke with Jacob, asked questions about his mental state, and concluded that he was suffering from what might be called melancholy or nervous exhaustion, conditions that were understood to affect men who spent too long in isolation, and that would likely improve with time and with continued contact with family. But the improvement the doctor predicted did not materialize. Through April and into May, Jacob remained fundamentally altered. He could perform basic tasks, he could chop wood, could tend to livestock, could help with spring planting, but he did so mechanically, without the engagement or the subtle judgments that made work effective rather than merely completed. He followed instructions when Ruth told him what needed to be done, but he showed no initiative, no ability to see what needed attention and to address it without being directed. More troubling was his relationship to time and to routine. He would sometimes stand motionless for long periods, staring at nothing in particular, seemingly unaware that time was passing. Ruth would find him in the morning, standing in the same position he had been in when she had last seen him the previous evening, apparently having stood through the entire night without sleeping or sitting or moving. When she asked him about this, he seemed confused by the question, as if he had not realized that anything unusual had occurred. He also began to show what could only be described as confusion about where he was. He would sometimes refer to the homestead as if it were his trapline cabin, would speak about needing to check traps that did not exist, would prepare to leave on rounds through territory that was now 30 miles distant. When corrected, when Ruth reminded him that he was home, that the trapping season was over, that his trap line was no longer his concern, he would accept the correction, but without any sign of surprise or recognition that he had been confused. The children adapted to their father's strangeness by avoiding him when possible, and treating him with the wariness they might show a stranger when avoidance was not possible. They did not ask him questions, did not seek his attention, and grew quieter and more subdued in ways that Ruth found almost as concerning as Jacob's condition. The family was fracturing under the weight of his presence. His physical return had not restored him to them, and his continued strangeness was creating an absence that was in some ways harder to endure than his actual absence during the winter had been. By June, Ruth had to acknowledge that Jacob was not recovering, that whatever the winter had done to him was not temporary, and that she needed to make decisions about how the family would function, given that he could not function as he had before. She consulted with neighbors, with the minister, with anyone who might have advice or experience with similar situations. The consensus was that some men never fully recovered from hard winters, that isolation could break something in a person that did not heal, and that Ruth might need to accept that Jacob would require care and supervision rather than being able to serve as husband and father in the ways he had before. This realization was devastating, but also practical. Ruth could not continue to operate the homestead alone, while also caring for 3 children and for a husband who required constant attention to ensure he did not wander off or stand motionless for hours, or forget to eat unless reminded. She made the decision to sell the homestead, to move closer to her family in a more settled area where she would have support and where Jacob could be supervised by multiple people rather than being her sole responsibility. The move occurred in July of 1893, 8 months after Jacob had entered the winter woods. The homestead was sold at a loss. Ruth was in no position to negotiate, and buyers knew it, and the family relocated to a small house near Ruth's parents. Jacob accepted the move without apparent awareness that it represented a significant change in their circumstances, or a permanent alteration to the life they had built together over 8 years of marriage. In the new location, with help from Ruth's family, the situation stabilized at a level that was manageable, if not normal. Jacob was given simple tasks that he could complete under supervision. He was watched to ensure he did not wander. He was fed and clothed and housed, treated more as a dependent than as an adult, more as someone to be cared for than as someone who could care for others. He lived another 42 years, dying in 1935 at the age of 75. Those 42 years were spent in a state that never progressed beyond what had emerged in the months following his return from the winter woods. He never recovered the ability to engage fully with his family, never regained the initiative or the connection that had characterized him before the winter of 1892 to 1893. He remained present, but distant, functional but detached, alive but fundamentally altered in ways that defied medical explanation or recovery through time and care. Ruth remarried in 1898, 5 years after Jacob's return. With Jacob's passive consent and with the understanding that she needed a partner who could actually function as a husband and as a father to the children, Jacob lived in the same household, cared for by Ruth and her new husband, an arrangement that was unusual but that reflected the practical reality that he required care and that Ruth was not willing to abandon him despite his inability to function in their marriage. The children grew up with a father who was present, but absent, who knew their names but did not know them, who existed in their household, but not in their lives in any meaningful way. They learned not to ask him questions, not to expect responses, not to seek from him the things that children normally seek from fathers. They adapted to his strangeness and eventually moved away to establish their own families, carrying with them the knowledge that their father had been taken by something during a winter in the woods and had never fully returned. Jacob's story was known in the community where he lived, but was not widely discussed. He was the man who had gone into the winter woods and had come back wrong, the example used to warn young men that trap lines could cost more than frostbite or hunger, that isolation had dangers that went deeper than physical hardship. But what specifically had happened to him? What mechanism had transformed him so completely? This remained a mystery that neither medical examination nor careful questioning could resolve. Various explanations were proposed over the years. Some suggested that he had suffered a stroke or some other brain injury during the winter, that physical damage rather than psychological trauma explained his condition. But the lack of paralysis or other typical stroke symptoms made this unlikely. Others proposed that he had experienced some kind of nervous breakdown, that the stress of the winter had fractured his mind in ways that could not be repaired. This was more consistent with his symptoms, but did not explain why the breakdown had been so complete and so permanent when most men who suffered such crises eventually recovered at least partially. A few people, particularly those inclined to more supernatural interpretations, suggested that something had happened to Jacob in the woods that went beyond natural explanation, that he had encountered something or experienced something that had taken part of him or had changed him in ways that transcended normal psychological or physical damage. These explanations were generally dismissed as superstition, but they persisted because they seemed to account for aspects of Jacob's condition that medical or psychological explanations struggled with. The sense that he was not merely damaged, but fundamentally different, not merely broken, but transformed into something other than what he had been. What can be documented with certainty is that Jacob Harlan entered the winter woods in November of 1892 as a capable, engaged, functional man, and emerged in March of 1893 as someone who could no longer fully engage with his life or his family or the world around him. The transformation was complete, was permanent, and occurred during a period when he was alone in winter wilderness, facing conditions that were severe but not unprecedented. That should have been endurable for someone with his experience, and that did not obviously contain any element that would explain why he was so profoundly altered when others who faced similar conditions returned fundamentally unchanged. The winter of 1892 to 1893 was difficult across the Ozark region, but it did not produce other cases like Jacob's. Other trappers worked lines through that winter. Other men spent months in isolation. Other families endured the cold and the snow and the hardship. They emerged tired, worn, sometimes marked by frostbite or hunger, but they emerged as themselves, capable of returning to their lives and their families and their work. Jacob alone came back transformed, came back as someone who would never fully return, regardless of time or care, or the love of the family that tried desperately to reach him. We have reached the end of this journey through one of the Ozark Plateau's most profound mysteries, a man who walked into winter woods as one person and emerged as another, who faced hardship that should have been endurable and was instead transformed by it in ways that neither he nor anyone who tried to help him could explain or reverse. Jacob Harlan walked into the winter woods in 1892, and whatever he experienced there during those 4 months alone, in cold and silence and isolation, took something from him that could never be restored, changed him so fundamentally that the man who emerged in March of 1893 bore his name and his face, but was no longer the person his family had known, leaving them to care for a stranger who looked like their husband and father, but who had been replaced by someone whose gaze was always directed inward or backward, towards something they could not see, and that he could not explain. If you've made it this far on this journey through territory, where isolation becomes transformation, and where winter takes more than warmth or strength or health, consider subscribing to Commute Tales for more stories that explore the boundaries between hardship and fundamental change, between endurance and permanent alteration. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on what extended isolation might reveal or remove, on where the line falls between normal effects of solitude and profound transformation on what you think Jacob experienced during those 4 months alone in the frozen woods. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you think about what parts of ourselves require human connection to maintain and what might happen if that connection is severed for too long, a like helps bring these narratives to more people who appreciate stories that remind us that isolation's dangers extend beyond cold or hunger or physical harm, that some things taken from us during months of solitude cannot be recovered through warmth and food and the return to human company, and that sometimes a man can walk into winter woods and walk back out, but leave behind whatever essential thing made him himself. Until our next journey into territories where winter changes more than seasons and where solitude takes more than it should, watch for those who return from isolation. Notice whether they came back entirely, and remember that somewhere in the Ozark Plateau, a man once entered winter woods as a husband, father, and capable trapper, and emerged 4 months later as someone who bore his name, but had lost the capacity to be any of those things, who lived another 42 years without ever recovering what the winter had taken, and whose family spent decades caring for someone who looked like the man they had known, but who had been fundamentally and irreversibly transformed into a stranger by experiences that occurred alone in frozen wilderness, during a winter that was severe, but should not have been impossible, that was difficult, but should not have been sufficient to break a man so completely that he never returned to himself, even when he returned to his home.